Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for being here today. My name's Eric Stokin. I'm the director of the Center for Social Science Scholarship. We're very excited to have you here and to be co-hosting this lecture series with the Department of American Studies. This is the last Social Science Forum lecture for this academic year, so very excited to have a renowned speaker here today. We'd like to thank our co-sponsors for co-hosting this event, and that includes the Drescher Center for the Humanities, the Department of History, the Orser Center for the Study of Place, Community, and Culture, the Department of Political Science, and the School of Public Policy. The Social Science Forum lecture series has been around for more than 25 years now and has had speakers from across the world and some very renowned speakers. And I'm extremely thrilled to have Dr. DerekHyra here today. I think we'll all agree that this topic is of great importance. The title of Dr. Hyra's recent book, Slow and Sudden Violence, Why and When Uprisings Occur, is of course of great importance to UMBC and the broader Baltimore community where some of this work takes place. I had the opportunity to share with Derek earlier that for several years now, I have assigned Michael Katz's work, Why American Cities Don't Burn Very Often. And, you know, he, in that work, sort of explains why we don't see civil violence being directed at the state for some time. And, you know, he's writing this work in the early 2000s. And of course, it's sort of interesting in the aftermath to see that, you know, we have had significant uprisings across the United States and elsewhere. And, you know, somewhat to my delight and chagrin, seeing this, you know, I would pose to students, you know, the question of like, why are we seeing this then, you know, in light of his work? So I think Dr. Hyra offers a very powerful answer here, and I'm very excited to have him speak about this work today. While this is the final Social Science Forum lecture for this academic year, we're already looking forward to next fall. So you can find out, you know, more about the events that we have at CS3 at socialscience.umbc.edu. We also have, you know, we're on all the major social media sites, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, others. And we have our very own Retrieving the Social Sciences podcast. So you can hear more about the work that's happening across the social sciences with our very own co-host, Dr. Ian Anson. Thank you again for being here today. I'll now turn things over to Dr. Nicole King, Associate Professor in the Department of American Studies, to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. And I want to give a special shout out to Amy and to Morgan, because without their work, we wouldn't have been able to get everything together today. So thanks to the people who do the hard work, and to Amy, who got a Presidential Staff Award today. So just another round of applause there. And I agree with Eric. We're so excited. Since I saw Derek talk about this book shortly after it came out at Red Emma's, I really wanted to bring him to UMBC and hear more. I read it as soon as it came hot off the presses. And Derek's analysis innovatively links the sudden police violence, which receives vast media attention, to the deep and more hidden cycle of racial and spatial urban redevelopment, repression, and inequality. So these forces unfortunately informed Freddie Gray's life, from the documented lead poisoning in his home when he was just 2 years old, to the moment officers threw him while handcuffed into a police van, severing his spinal cord when he was just 25 years old. This violent act occurred simply because Gray ran after making eye contact with a police officer in a West Baltimore neighborhood that was considered a high crime area. Back in spring of 2015, my UMBC colleagues and I had just started the Baltimore Traces Community and Transition Public History Project that documented and analyzed how neighborhoods change, and more centrally, how the people who live and work in those neighborhoods feel about those changes. When the pinnacle moment of the uprising happened on Monday, April 27th, 2015, I was working from home when people ran down my street in a day of chaos in the city that I love. I stayed up late reading Twitter, back when it was still actually useful, and watching TV and news media. After just a few hours of sleep, I walked by ransacked businesses as members of the National Guard flashed automatic weapons and police helicopters buzzed above to reluctantly board the shuttle to campus to teach. Because that's what you do when things get difficult, we do what we do, like we are now. So I received a message from a student asking if he could miss class to go record audio interviews with people at Red Emma's bookstore and cafe, which at the time was in the Station North neighborhood. And this was part of our class podcast for public radio. And I said yes. The student recorded the concluding lines of the first Baltimore Traces Station North Voices podcast that day. Nadja Bentley Hammond, who worked at the time at the Yes Drop-In Center for Homeless Youth in Station North, told him, "I think the city is tired. So we need to figure out the problem, the real issues. Let's figure out what's wrong and ask why. If you're doing something wrong, share why. Some people will listen. Some people will not and just see violence. But a lot of people will listen if you say why." And I think this is a great conclusion to a podcast because it leaves you wanting to know more, wanting to listen more, wanting to know why. And I also think it's the great basis for a book. And that's why we're here today, to continue that discussion of why and when uprisings occur. So I want to conclude with some information on what has happened in Baltimore in the past 10 years since 2015. And I recommend picking up a print copy or reading online the free Baltimore Beat, which is a black lead paper, and this edition was dedicated to the uprising and is still on stands now. So in the article, A Mass Movement, A History of the Baltimore Uprising from the Ground Up by journalist Baynard Woods, who was a reporter for the Baltimore City paper back when it existed in 2015 during the uprising. He was also a court reporter for The Guardian in 2016 during the trials of the officers charged but not convicted for the murder of Freddie Gray. And for the sake of transparency, he's also my husband, and he's sitting right there. Baynard writes, maybe I should get him to read it. In the 10 years since Baltimore police officers killed Gray, roughly 3,100 people, mainly Black men, have been murdered in Baltimore. More than twice that many have suffered fatal overdoses. One mayor, one state's attorney, and one police commissioner have been convicted on federal charges. More than 15 police officers have been implicated in the Gun Trace Task Force RICO case, where officers conspired to illegally detain and rob Baltimore residents. More than $70 million has been paid out in settlements relating to police misconduct. The Baltimore Police Department's budget has increased by nearly $100 million. BPD has shot at least 59 people. Adnan Syed, whose case at the time of Gray's death was a national obsession, saw the charges against him dropped and then reinstated. More than 130 units in 6 buildings at Gilmore Homes, where Gray was arrested, have been vacated. While Perkin Homes and Poe Homes, other public housing projects have been either demolished or completely boarded up. None of the officers who killed Gray were convicted, and no one has ever been held accountable for his death. And Gray never got a chance to grow or mature past 25 years. And his family and his friends have missed not only the 10 birthdays he never got to experience, but every day in between. So last week on a public radio spot with Lisa Snowden, who's the editor of the Baltimore Beat, and West Baltimore photographer Devin Allen, they were discussing a joint exhibition they did for the Baltimore Museum of Art on the uprising with Devin's photographs. You should check that out too. At the end of the radio spot, the host asked what they wanted people to take away from the exhibition and this edition of the Baltimore Beat. Lisa simply said, the humanity. Devin added, the humanity of Freddie. And he wanted to say, and I say this to all the students sitting in this room at this busy point in the semester, you are never too small to make change. So with that, I want to introduce our esteemed speaker. Derek Hyra is a professor in the Department of Public Administration and Policy within the School of Public Affairs at American University. He received his BA from Colgate University and his PhD from University of Chicago. His research focuses on processes of neighborhood change with an emphasis on housing, urban policy, and race. In addition to the book we're talking about today, he's the author of Race, Class, and Politics in the Cappuccino City and The New Urban Renewal, The Economic Transformation of Harlem and Bronzeville, a book that has deeply influenced my thinking on cities. He also co-edited Capital Dilemma, Growth and Inequality in Washington, D.C., and he is currently co-editor of the Penn Press book series, Disrupting Urban Policy. Derek also strongly believes in professional and public service. He has served in several positions, including board chair of the Alexandria Redevelopment and Housing Authority in Alexandria, Virginia, planning commissioner. Obama appointed him on the U.S. Small Business Administration's Council on Underserved Communities, and he was chair of the American Sociological Association's Community and Urban Sociology section, among many other accomplishments. He's also spent a great deal of time today talking with me and my colleagues, and you're in for a treat tonight. So please help me welcome Derek Hyra to UMBC.
Wow. Thank you, Eric and Nicole, for that introduction. It's an incredible honor to be here with all of you at this particular moment and be a part of this forum. This forum and this series have been going on for 25 years, which is incredible for a speaker series. And people like Robin Kelly, Kathy Cohen, Catherine McKintrick have been speakers here, and all of them have influenced my work greatly. And to be following in their footsteps as a scholar is a real honor and privilege. So I want to thank you for giving me that opportunity. You know, as Nicole mentioned, this is a critical time period. It is a reflection point. It is 10 years since the killing and murder of Freddie Gray. And I think it is a moment where we should be thinking about what are the conditions that undergird violent actions like this by the police, but not just the police actions. And as I'm going to talk about in the book, not just the sudden violence of the police, the slow violence of our urban policies that create the poverty concentration conditions that police monitor, surveil, and sometimes kill African Americans. So this is what the book does, and this is what we're going to discuss today. We're going to look at the undercurrents of the uprisings in Ferguson and in Baltimore. But I have to say, in the presentation, because we're in Baltimore County, we're going to focus on Baltimore. I mean, you know, we care about Ferguson, but let's unpack and try to understand a little bit what happened here. And we have experts in the room. It's all of you. So this shouldn't be a monologue. It should be a dialogue. And I'm going to try, although I like to talk, as you could probably tell, to keep it brief so that we can have a back and forth and that your expertise comes to the forefront. My job is just to create a platform for dialogue. I am not the expert, but I'm going to, give my opinions. And these are not my opinions. I'm an ethnographer. This comes from the community. So I walked the streets of Sandtown. I walked the streets of Southeast Ferguson. And I talked with people in their homes, on the street, in organizations, at the bar, about what they felt were the underpinnings of the uprise. So I'm going to present some of that. And so when I make claims, these are not my claims. These are the claims that are coming from the community. All right, so let's get it started. So Eric mentioned this book. And, I put academic motivation because we don't need motivation from a scholar to try to understand and unpack what's going on. I mean, we all want to know, right? And we all want to be a part of the solution. But, we are at an academic institution. I am a scholar, so I have to give sort of the academic rationale. And this comes from Michael Katz. He wrote this book, Why Don't American Cities Burn? And he published this in 2012. He was motivated by the uprisings not the uprisings here in the US. He was concerned with France. In 2005, the French cities on the periphery were burning. And it was related to police brutality against people of color. And, cars were burning, there was a huge pushback, and there was an uprise that spread throughout all of France. And Michael Katz is sitting there at Penn and saying, wait a minute, I think the conditions of concentrated poverty and of segregation are worse in the United States. So if we believe the theory that absolute deprivation relates to why people push back against the state, American cities should be burning. We had a doubling of concentrated poverty neighborhoods from 1970 to 1990, and we didn't have a big pushback, but in France they did. So he wanted to understand why. Why were people pushing back in one country and not in another? So the red belts in France are pushing back, and in the black belts in the United States, not much is going on in terms of a revolt and an uprise during the time period he was interested in. And he theorized one of the main reasons why was racial political representation. That African Americans, after the great pushback of the 1960s, made it into municipal leadership, became city council members, became mayors, became black developers, got on the housing authority boards, and controlled sometimes public housing authorities. And that wasn't the case in France. So one of his theories is we in the United States had greater racial representation in municipal government, and that might have explained why there wasn't greater pushback. And we're going to get back to racial representation in a moment, because I'm sure some of you know Baltimore politics. But Michael Katz died in 2014. He died before the Great Rebellion. So when I say the Great Rebellion, some of you know who I'm referring to, and that's Lawrence Brown, who wrote The Black Butterfly about Baltimore. And he coined the term the Great Rebellion to signify what happened in our country between 2014 and 2020. So with the killing of Michael Brown, the rough ride that kills Freddie Gray, and then the knee to the neck of George Floyd and his murder in Minneapolis, our country erupted. And we got some historians like Derek Musgrove, who's going to give some critical comments about my work. But we had a time to talk a little bit in Vancouver, and he said, Derek, what we had here, he shares my name. So, I'm going to be saying, I should say, I guess, Derek M. Derek H., that's me. I said to Derek M says to me, we had a real pushback in the 1960s, and I'm not sure the pushback from the Great Rebellion 2014 to 2020 was as great. It was. It happened in even more cities. Now, the damage might have been worse in the 60s, but the pushback was just as strong in the post-2010 period. So, my book is really about trying to understand why. What happened that relates to this great pushback? So we've got some contemporary literature here that is looking at the period of 2010 and beyond. And so, of course, aggressive policing, right? I mean, I think all of you understand that that is definitely related to why people hit the streets and hit them hard. We also have things like situational factors. So there's some scholars that are looking at during peaceful protests, and remember, after George Floyd was murdered, we had over 9,000, almost 10,000 protests that happened across the United States. Only 6% of them devolved into violence. And some scholars have looked at, okay, well, what are counter-protesters doing at these peaceful protests that may be related to violence? What are the police doing at these peaceful protests? So we look at these situational factors at protests. So we've got some work on that. Now, we got some gaps here, I feel, in the literature. Looking at structural factors. When I say structural factors, I'm talking about municipal levels of segregation, the amount of displacement, gentrification, right? These are things that the Kerner Commission looked at. So the Kerner Commission is published in 1968 after the uproar that we had after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and looking at all the uprisings that we had in the 50s and in the 60s. And the Kerner Commission looked at structural factors in addition to what the police were doing with police brutality. But there seems to be few studies, I got a couple of them down there, that are really looking at these structural factors related to the Great Rebellion in the contemporary time period. And then we have no studies that are doing the historical perspective, trying to connect the old urban renewal. What happened in our country in the 40s, 50s, leading up to the uprises of the 60s? And then how is that connected to what I coin the new urban renewal? A period that I'll get into, but basically from 1993 until maybe all the way up to the present, what is happening in our cities with urban restructuring, and how are the old and the new urban renewals connected? So let me just give you a sort of picture that helps represent what I mean by the old urban renewal. So I guess on, I got to turn around so I can get on your left. We have a picture of the Robert Taylor homes on the south side of Chicago. The Robert Taylor homes goes up. It also then comes down. So the old urban renewal, I'm talking about from 1949 to 1973, federal money that is being deployed to our cities, mainly through the public housing authorities, land clearance commissions, that are basically destroying Black and brown communities. And it's just not money for housing, it's also money for transportation. You got the highway to nowhere. You guys probably know a little bit something about that. That just, cuts right through Black West Baltimore. So we've got Black community destruction and displacement happening on a massive scale, undergirded by federal funds, that is happening all throughout the United States. Mindy Fullilove writes a book called Root Shock, which is about when people's communities get destroyed, they die because their networks are ripped apart, their communities are ripped apart, their memories are ripped apart. And that is part of the old urban renewal. Now, the new urban renewal. We got another picture up there that is the Starbucks. And there's another public housing project from Chicago. That's North Chicago. That's Cabrini Green. I took that picture in 2000. Well, the Starbucks is still there, but that high rise is gone. And what's in its place is $400,000 and $500,000 condos. So Cabrini Green was decimated. All of the people that lived there were displaced. That is the new urban renewal. From 1993 to, maybe we could argue, to 2025, the federal government has deployed billions of dollars to take down public housing. And you guys know that because that is still going on, as Nicole mentioned, right here in Baltimore. So the slow violence is the policy violence of Black community destruction. And what I'm trying to do in this book is link that to then the sudden violence of police brutality, and then link those two things to the uprise. All right, so the research question: how has the history of housing and community redevelopment policies set the context for the contemporary U.S. uprisings? My argument: intense frustrations related to a cycle of racial and spatial repression perpetuated over time by slow violence, cumulative state-level aggressions help to explain contemporary unrest. All right, so how do I do this? So again, I'm an ethnographer. I tried to become a historian and an ethnographer. I don't know if I did the history part real well, but I basically went to Ferguson and I went to Baltimore. So people are like, well, why these two places? There were uprisings, and why didn't I go to New York? Why didn't I go to DC? Why didn't I go to Minneapolis, LA? I could have went to these places, but I felt to understand the Great Rebellion, why not go to where it started? The first uprising was Ferguson. The second uprising was Sandtown and Baltimore. The other reason I went to these two particular places is because Ferguson is a suburb. Sandtown is the inner city. So why is a suburban area, and you know the stereotypes of suburban America: white, two-car garage, big home, lawn, white picket fence, right? Uprisings in the suburbs? Well, we need to understand that poverty has moved from the inner city to the inner suburb. And I wanted to understand and compare why in one municipality, the greater St. Louis region, why did the uprise start in the inner suburb, and why did the uprising happen here in the inner city? So I felt that was a good comparison. The other thing, and we'll get to this, is like politics. Ferguson is a Black municipality. It once was a sundown town. It once was majority white, but now it is more than 80% African American. But politically, when the uprisings happened there, it was controlled by whites. The mayor was white. The city council was majority white. The police force was vastly white. The judicial system that governed it, white. It was what I call in the book plantation politics. I put it pretty simple and bluntly. But Baltimore is Chocolate City. So Derek M. wrote a book, Chocolate City. When I say Chocolate City and I say Baltimore, he looks at me like, what are you talking about? Because he writes about Baltimore, he lives in DC, and he's written an amazing book about DC called Chocolate City. So Chocolate City is about the Black majority population, but it is also Black political empowerment, right? And Black control over the municipal government. That happened in DC, but that happened here in Baltimore, right? We got Kurt Smoke, the first elected Black mayor. And we had a Black mayors after him. We've got the city council, which is majority Black. Most of the political positions here in the city lean and usually are majority in terms of governing coalitions, Black. But we had the uprise here. So how do we understand the conditions that undergird an uprise when we have Black political representation? Michael Katz's book said if we got a place like Baltimore that's controlled by African Americans, we shouldn't have the uprise, but we did. So I think that these two cases are really good to put against one another and try to compare and contrast what happened in these two municipal regions. Yeah, so just again, I'm an ethnographer. So what did I do? I came down, I drove up, I'm from DC. Now I live in Northern Virginia. That made a little bit of an irony. But I drove up 95 and just plopped myself down in Sandtown. And some of you are probably like, you did what? And I'll tell you kind of a funny story. So I've spent a lot of time in Harlem. I spent a lot of time in Bronzeville on the south side of Chicago. I spent a lot of time in Shaw U Street, the Harlem of Washington, D.C. And when I came up to Sandtown, I was like, I'm fine. I can hang. I know I'm comfortable in spaces like this. And I had a student of mine, Lawrence Anderson, who was the chief of staff for Nick Mosby, who helped Nick Mosby for quite a while when he was a council member, and then his first mayoral run and lost. Well, his campaign manager was Lawrence Anderson. And Lawrence Anderson said to me, Derek, you just can't come into Baltimore and you just can't come into Sandtown and get out of your car and walk around. I said, okay, well then you come with me and show me what to do. And I remember we got out of the car at the Gilmore Homes. I get out, ayo, ayo. I mean, I know what that means. So I'm looking around. I'm like, Lawrence, we're fine. But then, a couple people approach us and I said, look, I'm working on this book. And they were like, oh, really? And then Lawrence had to come and negotiate. Then we were fine. Because Lawrence knew how to handle himself in Sandtown. But I walked Sandtown. I interviewed people in the community, not just in Sandtown, but downtown. If you want to understand Sandtown, you got to understand downtown. Hopefully I'll connect that in the talk. But I interviewed clergy, activists, small business owners, nonprofit leaders, and I did that in both municipalities. I did that from 2018 to 2022. One thing that's interesting about the study is I did all my field work here in person. And I walked the streets, I met people in coffee shops, like I said, and then we had the pandemic. And I had a sabbatical. I was all ready to go to Ferguson. And I had to walk the streets of Ferguson at first through Google Maps. And then I thought to myself, well, I guess I'm writing a case study about Baltimore because I am an ethnographer. I need to be on the street. I need to talk to people. I need to feel people. I need to feel where they're coming from. I need to build trust and rapport with people. Nicole mentioned humanity. That's what it's about. It's a humanistic approach to understanding and learning. And to be honest, I can't do that online. Maybe some of you can. I can't. I need to be in the bar and having drinks with people to really know what they're saying. But eventually we get out of the pandemic and I get to the Ferguson Brewery and I start interviewing people in person. I walk the streets of Southeast Ferguson and then I know I can write this book. I also do a little bit of archival work, but maybe that's not that relevant, but you'll see why it is. All right. You guys know where these cities are, so I don't need to dwell on that. So let's get to the findings. So my participants, when I asked them what is related to the uprise, of course, people instantly said policing. This bullshit policing is what people are frustrated about. The police are killing our community members and we are going to the street. And then after that, one woman who's an activist in Ferguson said, hey, Derek, if you want to understand why people pushed back in the way they did, let me tell you the story about my grandmother. And let me tell you about where she lived in St. Louis. And then she said, and now let me tell you about my father and tell you about the public project that he lived in, and then he was displaced. And then let me tell you about my origin story and how I ended up going from North City, St. Louis to in and near Ferguson. And she said to me, if you really want to understand things and you want to understand the frustrations that people have, you've got to go all the way back to the early 20th century. So she told me, Derek, stop being a contemporary ethnographer. You have to become a historian. And so I did. And that's why I went back to the archives. But let me sum up the argument here, this cumulative state aggression. So we have to look at the 1910 to 1930 and the segregation and the divestment that happened in low-income communities of color. Then we have to understand 1940 to 1960, the ghetto walls go up. And when I say the ghetto walls, I'm talking about high-rise public housing that surrounds our central business district to protect white business owners and their businesses in the downtown. But that's the old urban renewal, right? And then the new urban renewal, the ghetto walls come down. We knock down the high-rise public housing. It's not a downtown protection mechanism, it's a downtown expansion. This is the back to the city movement. People want to be back to the central city. It has to expand. So to expand it, we got to tear down the projects. And then you get gentrification, you get increased spatial inequality, and the police violence. So let's unpack that a little bit more. So segregation and redlining. I don't need to go in depth in this, but in 1910, I mean, you know, Baltimore is the first municipality in the United States that has legalized segregation through its zoning, right? This isn't South Africa. This is America. But we had American apartheid in our municipal code. Sometimes when I teach my students, they don't remember that. They don't know that. They don't think that that's their America. Of course it is. Right, so we segregate places, and then we have the homeowners or the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation that basically says if a community is majority black, they're not getting any loans. So then the areas that we segregate get divested. Baltimore does it in 1910, St. Louis does it in 1916, and many municipalities do it up until 1917, where it becomes then unconstitutional. But that sets the wheels in motion. So the areas that are majority black or brown then get divested. And this is a picture from St. Louis. This is Mill Creek Valley. Mill Creek Valley was in the central business district of St. Louis, and this was the Harlem of St. Louis. And it's interesting, when I started my field work, I asked people, I said, well, where's the historic black neighborhood? They said, what the hell are you talking about? I said, well, where's the Harlem? And they said, it doesn't exist. I said, yeah, right. So you think about Sandtown, which some might say that's the Harlem of Baltimore. It still exists, right? Think about Harlem. Think about Shaw U Street, another area in DC that is the heart of black Washingtonians or Washingtonian. It's gentrified, but it's still there. You go to St. Louis, the historic black community is not there because it's been leveled. There's no murals, or there are no murals. There are no plaques. Mill Creek Valley is gone. So thousands of African Americans got displaced when Mill Creek Valley went down. And then where did they go? This is Pruitt-Igoe. So from the central corridor to the northern corridor.
Derek Hyra, another round of applause for Derek. We'll pass it off to you, Martha.
Okay. Here we go. Thank you. Thank you, Derek, for a wonderful talk. And it says here that I'm supposed to introduce myself and my connection to Baltimore really quickly before answering my question. So I came to Baltimore when I was 5, and I actually went to church around the corner from Sandtown, Winchester. I went to Bethel AME Church. And probably one of the most bizarre memories that I have, and I'll just open with this and then move on to the question, is that when I finished my first book, right when I got here to UMBC in 2012, I went back to my old church. I had since moved to Washington, D.C., and gave a book talk. The pastor was kind enough to open up the pulpit to me. And what struck me was that for those of you who know Bethel AME, it's a huge white stone church that sort of looms over Sandtown, Winchester, right at the right before you get to the hill that heads towards downtown. And it used to be a relatively full block of houses next to the church where there were people in every single one of those houses except for 1 or 2 that were boarded up. But generally it was a well-populated block on, I think it's Roland Park Avenue. Pardon me if I'm wrong there. And what struck me when I went back to do the book talk is every single one of those houses was empty and boarded up. And had you projected had you sort of looked up the hill towards the reservoir on Roland Park Avenue, which W.E.B. Du Bois, when he visited the city in the early 20th century, said was the jewel of the Black East Coast. It was sort of akin to parts of Harlem as far as the number of well-to-do African Americans, the learning, the good newspaper, all of those things that you could find off of Roland Park Avenue in Old West Baltimore. And if you looked back up the hill, that image that I had seen on the block next to my church was projected all the way to North Avenue and beyond that to the reservoir. And it was positively shocking because that was just within a part of my lifetime. I mean, I had left Baltimore when I was in my early 20s. I was coming back in my mid-30s to give this book talk, and all those people were gone. And so something had happened in that neighborhood that it's created these circumstances, and that would eventually, as Derek, I think, so wonderfully points out, leads us to the Baltimore uprising of 2015 after the sudden violence of the death of Freddie Gray. And one of the things I'd love for you to talk more about, Derek, is this idea that you really do explore wonderfully in the book, and I don't think you had enough time to talk about in the presentation, which is this idea of neoliberal Black violence, or neoliberal Black governance, I should say. We sometimes forget, because we have Ferguson in our mind, where it was a white mayor, majority white city council, a white police chief, and a lot of them were just flat out racist. And they treated their majority Black constituency as a piggy bank for a city that really couldn't pay its own bills. But in Baltimore, when Freddie Gray was killed, the mayor was Black. City council was majority Black. Congressman was Black, and a great one, Elijah Cummings, right? And the DA was Black, and had, sort of the primary prosecutorial responsibility when it came to working with the police to deal with drug dealing in Sandtown, Winchester. And particularly, Michael Katz lays out a challenge to you. You read the book as a challenge to you, which is, how do you explain that? I mean, because the assumption coming out of the Black Power movement was that if you could get Black faces in high places, you could change the institutions that had degraded Black life. And what you seem to be saying is you could, but it didn't necessarily happen that way. And so could you just speak to that, please?
Yeah, Derek, thank you. It's a great question. And it's a difficult one to answer. But if you think about Baltimore and the election of Kurt Schmoke, I mean, he's a hometown hero. I mean, an amazing football player, goes to Yale, from Yale, Rhodes Scholar, then goes to Harvard, then comes back to the city to make a difference. And again, I had the honor and privilege of interviewing him for the book. And I have to say, after I interviewed him and the recorder goes off, and I just say to him, look, I've interviewed David Dinkins, first black mayor of New York City. I've interviewed a lot of mayors. And I said to him, I said, you're the most brilliant person that I've interviewed that took on this position. So why did you want to become mayor? I'm like, mayors are like, take no prisoners, and they're cursing. I'm thinking of like Mayor Daley. I'm thinking about some of the prior mayors that you've had here in Baltimore. And then think about Kurt Schmoke's intellect and then his scholarly trajectory and then coming back. Like, that's incredible. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that I asked him, I said to him, do you think the decision, I said, first of all, would you rip down the projects again? He was the mayor. I mean, he was greenlighting and advocating to get the Hope 6 money to knock down the projects. And he said to me, I'd absolutely do that again. They were warehouses for poverty and drugs and violence. Not that everybody in the projects was doing that, but it was affecting people in the projects that were just working class trying to get by. And it was affecting the entire city. So he's like, yeah, I'd rip them down. I'd do it again. And I said to him, all right, do you think knocking down the projects is related to the uprise? And he says, well, I don't know, Derek. He said, Sandtown was always struggling, was always impoverished. And impoverishment to him, he thought, was related to the pushback. And he said, I don't know if I made conditions worse. I do argue in the book, though, that decision did make things worse in terms of absolute poverty in the community. But he just said, I'm not really sure. And I said, yeah, we don't know, But then I said to him another question. I said, do you think knocking down the projects related to the gentrification that happened just off the Inner Harbor? And he says, Derek, absolutely. That's what I was trying to do. I was trying to build a tax base for this city. And that's the way I did it. So again, yes, I would rip down the projects. The projects I didn't think would lead to uprisings. I still don't think he thought that it related. But he said, I was trying to do something to stimulate the economic development and bring up the tax base here, and gentrification was part of that strategy. I was like, okay, tape recorder off. I got my quote, I go back. But that's the dilemma for a lot of black controlled cities. It is, if you look at some of these cities, some of them are highly impoverished. And mayors and council, whether black, white, Asian, Hispanic, Latino, they got to figure out how to garner a significant or sufficient tax base to govern the city, to, have the sewers working, the garbage picked up, the snow plowed, all those things, the social services that are needed. So it's tough. Derek and I were on a panel with Michael Owens, who's a political scientist at Emory. And he has a quantitative analysis that shows that having a black mayor increases the likelihood that public housing is going to be demolished, controlling for all other factors. So, Derek, the initial question was, what about this neoliberal black governance? We have it. The racial representation was not sufficient to address long-term issues related to concentrated poverty or to change the policing. So is black governance important? Absolutely. Is it sufficient to tackle the undercurrents of the unrest? No. So we have to do more than have racial representation.
I'm going to put together a couple of questions that we have, really excellent questions from the QR code. That's really was the question that I sent you in advance, and put actually way better. So one, are there examples of policies that work to short circuit the cycle you have so clearly described? Excellent question. And what is it about the US that makes our political uprisings so neutered? That's the first question.
Wait, but what? Say that again. What makes it?
What about the U.S.
Yeah.
makes our political uprisings suck, essentially, or be so neutered? Why don't they work? Why do they sputter out
I understand.
at a certain point? And then I have one to put this in a more global context of what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in Yemen, what kind of began with the Arab Spring, even before Occupy. So to put your work in a global context, if you get those two. And then I want to turn it over to the folks who are here.
All right. Let's see.
Yeah, that's just some.
Yeah,
Can you just?
Yeah, I'll just can rattle off answers to these really difficult, complex questions, and then even more complex to try to come up with some sort of solution. But I would say policies related to our context, how to short circuit the cycle of racial and spatial repression is one, just have one-for-one replacement of public housing. We actually had this in our federal law. It was repealed with Hope 6 and then permanently repealed with the Quality Housing Work Responsibility Act, which happened in 1998. Prior to these acts, if a municipality wanted to knock down public housing, they had to build another unit within its municipality, which made it very difficult financially. So if a developer wanted to seize that land and build those luxury high rises, they had to work with the city to figure out financially how to also replace one-for-one unit. Let's just bring it back. Bring back one-for-one replacement at the federal level. Now, Nicole mentioned that I was the board chair of a public housing authority. And when I did that, my friends thought I was crazy. They said, Derek, you fight housing authorities. You don't work with them. What are you doing? Like, what are you're going to go into real estate after this? You're going to cut some deal? Like, you're not making enough money as a professor? You're trying to get a kickback? Like, what the hell are you doing? And I said, no, there's a reason I joined it in this city, in Alexandria, because they had the municipal law, one-for-one replacement. So obviously, during this political climate, we're not getting one-for-one replacement back at the federal level. But Baltimore, if they wanted to do it, could institute it. So could LA. Alexandria still has it on the books. So there are certain cities that could execute on the one-for-one when it comes to subsidized housing. So I think that is one of the lead policy recommendations. But I also think there has to be some racial reckoning and remembrance and honoring about what happened. You know, Michael Brown's father wanted to build a park in a place that was a pool, that the pool was related to segregation. And when African Americans started to move closer to that pool, the whole pool shut down. And he said, oh, great, let's take that pool and let's understand that this level of discrimination and segregation relates to what happened to my son. And now let's open up a community center here. Also, in Ferguson, after James Knoll, who was the white mayor, who was Republican, that got elected before the uprising, during, and then after the uprising in Ferguson, he got ousted finally, and a woman, black mayor, got elected. And she said no to Michael Brown Sr. And she said, you sued us after your son was killed, which his family should have sued. And then she said, well, then because we're paying out so much in this, we don't have the money for the pool. But I just think that Ferguson just wants to erase the history of Michael Brown and of the uprise. But I think we have to embrace our difficult history and remember it like we're remembering the 10-year anniversary of Freddie Gray today. So I think that's important for cities to honor the people who have been displaced and who have been killed. So I would just think that's another policy that we should think about, and I talk about that in the book. Why don't U.S. protests usually lead to policy change? I think that was the question. And it is hard. I think about multiple protests that have happened in my lifetime. Occupy Wall Street. What did that do? Seriously. Not much. And when I think about the Black Lives Matter movement, It was important, and so was Occupy Wall Street, but what did it do? We took down monuments. We changed school names. Culturally, this is really important stuff. But what have we changed policy-wise to address segregation and neighborhood inequality? What have we done to change policing in our country? Very little. So why is that the case? We're a capitalist country. It is hard to fight Wall Street. It is, and City Hall has to work with Wall Street to get anything accomplished. The bond rating, the ability to borrow money as a city. You don't have to answer to the companies in your community. You got to answer to Wall Street. So I think that our capitalist system and our weak social safety net, which is related to the capitalist system, relate to why our protests sometimes don't lead up to significant policy change. And also, we're just a damn racist country. We know our history. And anytime you try to do something to acknowledge and take down the racist past, what comes up? Trump. And the people who support Trump. That's what makes it difficult to change things. All right, last thing, Gaza. I mean, Jesus, how do I answer that one? But what I hope is that my framing of slow and sudden violence can help explain the situations that we have in Gaza and other places. That when a certain population is dealing with the state picking at them and bullying them, it's only a matter of time before they fight back. And that bullying comes in different forms and fashions in different countries. But that is the slow violence. I mean, one person said to me, and I interviewed her here in Sandtown. She said, Derek, I feel like the police are picking on me. And I could understand what she was talking about. It's that, that bullying, that you feel the state is bullying you. And I guess that's the slow violence. And then the sudden violence is the state killing you. And we can see those two processes be linked in other places where we have significant pushback and revolts. So I hope that some of the lessons from the book does generalize enough to help people think through these situations and other international contexts.
So does anyone from the audience, I can bring you a microphone if you have a question.
I had a follow-up question. You were discussing how the one-for-one kind of public housing was kind of ended at the federal level in '98. Can you explain like what led up to that happening?
Yeah, I mean, we had a commission in 1989 that was a federally appointed commission to look at the state of our public housing across the United States. This commission came up with a recommendation to Congress to say that we have a lot of units that are insufficient in terms of their upkeep, and that the best thing that could be done is either rehab them with significant amount of money or knock them down and then give people vouchers, which have them find housing in the private market with a subsidy that comes from the state, which is cheaper to do. And then cities kind of pushed back and said, well, there's this thing, though, that we have to actually replace these units. We can't do it. So the compromise was to take out the one-for-one replacement so that cities, if they got some resources, could actually knock down the public housing, build mixed-income communities, and then voucher out the residents who are in public housing so they wouldn't go homeless. And that was a model to stimulate economic development. I mean, that's part of the new urban renewal, right? To stimulate gentrification around the central business corridor in cities across the United States. So, I mean, that's the lead up to why we took out that one-for-one replacement. Thank you for your question.
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. And I realize how well Nicole and Derek and Denise have prepared me for your talk so that I could understand everything as an early modernist. So I'm an economic historian, and I kind of want to make you even go back farther, I guess, and talk a little bit, and you may do this in your book. We didn't need the public housing. The public housing was not there just because of redlining. It was there because of loss of jobs, right, and poverty in Baltimore, at least. Ferguson, different situation. But without the loss of good working class jobs, right, is that like a piece of this pipeline to uprising, or where is that piece in your analysis? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I thought when you said we need to go further back, usually when people say that, they say, why didn't you go back to enslavement, right? If we're going to talk about this stuff. And I don't in the book. I start with the 20th century, but there's a reason I have this cover. This is Jacob Lawrence. And this is not from the Great Migration series. This is from the American Struggle series, which is his second series, which is all about revolts and pushbacks in the United States. And this depicts a slave revolt in 1773. And I do acknowledge in the book that we could go all the way back, and that's why I have the cover that I have, but I don't, because I feel like, when we talk about racial reparations, how do we go back and calculate what enslavement meant to a group of people financially? But we could go back to the early 20th century and just track and trace all the families that were displaced and all the areas that were redlined. And we could easily do that lineage and then figure out what it cost those families financially. But I don't go that far back. But anyway, your question was going to the labor market. And I think that isn't very much in the book, but it is really important. Because when we move, we have also the high rises due to industrialization. This is Baltimore. This is also St. Louis, right? I mean, we have manufacturing. So again, we have the great migrations. We have people coming in. We have low-rise housing settlements, and we got to knock those down. We put up the high rises because we still need the people in the high rise to work the factory jobs. But now the factory jobs start to move south. Then they start to move overseas. And then the projects just sort of sit there for a while, and then we don't have the financial capacity to upkeep them. But then we have a whole transition in our economy. We move from an industrial society to a post-industrial society. We have high-wage service sector workers and low-wage service sector workers. But we have more high-wage people that want to come into the city center, but they're kind of scared because we got the high rises. So we knock the high rises down to create the space for the increased number of high-wage service sector workers. And those low-wage service sector workers, they don't need to be close. They can commute. They can bounce out to the suburbs or wherever. But I think the answer is yes. To understand this urban restructuring and the way that it's going, we have to do the assessment of our national and the global economy. Nicole mentioned my first book, The New Urban Renewal, which is about the redevelopment of Harlem and Bronzeville on the south side of Chicago. And I do a deeper dive into the labor markets and how they've changed, and then how it relates to urban restructuring. With this book, I didn't do that as much. So it's probably a limitation, but it's, of course, important. So thank you.
Hey, Derek. Sarah Fouts. I'm Nicole King's colleague in American Studies. Two comments. One's more of a question, and then one's kind of a response to the organizing Occupy Wall Street. I think, especially with the group of students, really thinking about the impact that those actions had on society. Like Fight for 15 came out of that. You have a lot of different, kind of a public awareness of the 1%, like that's in the nomenclature. So I think really saying that had no impact is a little limiting to your argument there. And then also thinking about George Floyd, thinking about the uprising, reading about there maybe you're right about policy hasn't come out of it, but really kind of that's not at the fault of the uprisings, right? You need this kind of holistic approach coming from good politics, and that's That's not happening. What I think you do great is the kind of connecting these histories of, I'm shaking here.
We can hear you.
Connecting the histories of why this is happening and connecting it to displacement. I think we need more of that. And the person who asked about Gaza, I think that's a really great question. I think thinking about migration, why people are leaving, it's not just gang violence, right? We talk about that a lot, but it's a lot of being displaced off land. That's the root of migration. So I think what you're doing there is great, but I'd be careful with the kind of critiquing of these movements.
Can I talk on that actually? That was my question.
Yeah.
I put the context to you.
Keep going.
So I actually, that's partially my fault because I phrased the question, and the context of the question was why Occupy Wall Street, which was connected to the Arab Spring, was less effective than the Arab Spring. Not specifically saying that Occupy was not good or didn't. It was in comparison to a different uprising.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Tara, thank you for critiquing my response. And I think you're spot on. I mean, we have to think about, I don't know, it's just sometimes I think about these movements and then trying to connect them to significant federal policy changes. And that doesn't often happen, but it doesn't mean that these movements weren't impactful on many other fronts. But actually, if we go to the Occupy Wall Street, it might have been very important to the Community Financial Protection Bureau that got lofted, that Elizabeth Warren helped to bring about, which I think was really important to have another federal regulator in the space to monitor what banks were doing. Of course, that's all being undone now by the Trump administration, but if it wasn't for the protests at that time, the CFPB wouldn't have been created, I don't think. So there was some federal policy change. I just wish there was more. You know, I'm always like, I want more to come out of this. And I think about the Black Lives Matter movement and defund the police. And there was just a whole kind of movement of radical change. And then to see that radical change not come to the forefront in many municipal police budgets is frustrating. So it's not that nothing was done. And these things, it's just I always am looking for the movement that really is transformative, but transformative in concrete policy ways in the moment at the federal, the state, and the local level. But that often doesn't change, but that change takes time. I mean, think about the civil rights movement and how long, I mean, Derek's written so much about this, how long it took for then congressional federal action. So maybe we're in that process that it's just gonna take a long push, and then maybe those federal policy changes will come about. So thank you.
Got a question over here and then that one. And if you could ask yours and you ask yours, and then we'll turn it to you for those questions and concluding remarks. Does that sound good? Go ahead.
So where my interest lies is actually environmental justice. You highlighted how systemic disinvestment and gentrification can shape Black communities. Environmental racism operates in the same way through things like neglect, toxic exposure, lack of infrastructure. How do you see the relationship between urban redevelopment and environmental harm? And do you think that environmental justice can meaningfully pursue in areas where there's gentrification?
Wow. That's another fantastic question. Do we want to get the other question, or can I?
Or if you're ready to go.
Yeah, just go with that. And then we'll...
Sorry. I had to jump in right away. And that one was like, because if another question gets asked, I'm going to forget how to even respond to this. Not that I would forget the question, but it's a very difficult one that I think an awful lot about. So the concept of slow violence came about from a scholar that was writing about environmental injustices. And you could look at the environmental injustices, lead paint, putting garbage waste in communities of color, right? This happens over and over again throughout municipal America. So is the environment justice movement so important and part and parcel to the concept of slow violence? Absolutely. I'm a housing scholar and an economic development scholar, so I kind of focus on a particular slice of slow violence, but you could expand it with the things that you're talking about, even within housing, right? Whether the environmental justice movement can tackle equitable development and shift the narrative from gentrification and displacement to equitable development that develops communities for people so that they can stay in their community, I'm not sure, because I think the movement is going to get co-opted. And what I mean by that is we're all talking about environmental justice and environmental situations because of climate change. And where are the vulnerable communities that are more likely to flood and get hit hard by climate change? They're communities of color. And so we're going to have federal government money that just says, we're here to help you, meaning you as a low-income person in an environmental place that might get hit by a flood. So here's some money to leave. And then we'll have the Army Corps of Engineers come in and build a dam or build whatever and build luxury housing, right? So I'm fearful that environmental justice movements will be co-opted, will lead to more displacement. And think about Biden's Build Back Better bill. That's going to be used. It's hitting the streets now, but wait, let's evaluate what that does in 5 years. And I think there's going to be a lot of people that get displaced and get moved off of their homeland. It's just like with public housing. When public housing first came out, there were urban planners in the 1940s and 50s who said, this is a panacea for poverty. We are here to help. And all the scholars that supported Hope 6 and Kurt Schmoke said, I'm here to help. I'm knocking down the projects to help you who live in these projects. So we have to be careful with environmental movements because I think they're going to be used as a Trojan horse to get people off their homeland. So it's kind of a doom and gloom scenario, but maybe I'm wrong. I'm very dark. Go ahead with the last question. Hopefully we'll leave and feel hopeful.
Well,
Maybe-
yeah, so to build on that darkness, but also maybe towards some hopefulness, I know from a social science perspective that you're taking a societal sort of view, and so uprisings occur, and these things cause them. But there's also the agency of the people who organize them and activate them and make them happen. And so in your research, what did you learn about how someone could harness, could look around their community and see these slow violence conditions and organize an uprising? And then to sort of follow up on the second part of that, on the question over there, would be how and why do uprisings end, as another way of asking why they're so impotent here, and if you learned anything about not only how to start uprisings, but how to keep them going?
That's good. I do end the book with just saying if we don't address these root causes, then uprise today, uprise tomorrow, uprise forever. So we do.
That's a good thing. How do we...
That is it. I do. I mean, if the conditions are the way they are, people are justified in fighting back. And again, I lay this out in the book that I don't blame protesters or even protesters who get violent as doing something wrong. They are justified in their actions. So and that's something that is right in the beginning of the book, because sometimes people, use uprising versus riots or whatever terms used. Even if you don't use those terms, people say, like, are you supportive or blaming the people who are protesting? And I hope you walk away from this book that I'm very supportive and believe we need to keep fighting. But it's hard to fight in this climate, in this context, meaning with the Trump administration in right now. But your other critique was, what about like the motivation for the people or the networking that happens among the organizers? And there's not much of that in the book. And it is very much a critique of the book, but there were other scholars who have written about Ferguson who do a network analysis that literally spend all their time with the organizers. So I felt that those books, and I cite those books, I have it up front, and I say that work was done, and now, but here's some other work that maybe there's a gap here that we didn't fill in, and I'm going to fill that gap. But I would say that Kayla Reed is an organizer. She has St. Louis Action. And she was the one that said, you know, think about my grandmother, think about my father, and think about me. And she was working in a pharmacy. And then Michael Brown got shot. And she just left work. And she never went back. And she just organized and organized and organized. And she had no money. And a lot of people came and supported her. And then she started her own organization that was to sustain the movement. So to sustain the movement, it isn't just individuals being motivated. Institutions have to be created and then sustained with money. Because I've met a lot of organizers, and you know, organizers like Kayla Reed usually go for 2 years and then they get burnt out and then they just got to leave. But she's somebody who's amazing. It's also Dominic Moulton. I don't know how many of you know him, but he grew up here in the Perkins homes. And then he's been a very active organizer, not as much in Baltimore, but he's seeded a bunch of things here in Baltimore, but in Washington, D.C. I worked with him very intimately when I wrote the Cappuccino City book. And I look at him and think about how is somebody sustaining organizing for 30, 40 years? And that's incredible. But it does take resources. One thing I learned from Dominic, you know, I run a center and I fundraise. And I tell no to a lot of people. Eric and I were talking about this. I got corporations, real estate developers, private foundations coming to me and offering me money, but with strings attached. And every time that happens, I say no. I don't think my dean likes that or my university very much, but I do. And Dominic said to me, Derek, what are you doing? I said, what do you mean? He goes, you say no to all this money. At 1DC, we're black-led, black control. We don't say no to anybody's money. Because, you know, if you trace it, it's all blood money. And we take it and we use it to support our organizers. So take the money from whoever and just do it what you want. And I said, well, you might be able to pull that off. I don't know if I can. So I just say no. I don't want to get into that. But I'm just saying that to sustain these movements, we need motivated people, but we also need resources. And I think federal government resources, like the Community Development Block Grant, that can be used to undergird community-based organizations. Mayors sometimes use it for that, but sometimes they don't. But I think it's really important if we're going to sustain community organizing, we got to have local and federal and state money going to support organizations like Kayla Reed's organization in St. Louis. So anyway, hey, let's leave with a positive. The New York Yankees are down here tonight. They're playing the Orioles. The Orioles, I think, won last night. But, oh, they didn't? But didn't they? Wait, have they lost all the games? They won the first one. All right. So you have to understand that my son is a big baseball fan. You know, I live in D.C. or just outside of D.C., and so we go to the Nationals games, and they were good for a little while. They won a World Series, but then, you know, they ran tough times. So then we started coming up here, and all of a sudden, it used to be that, you know, the tickets were cheap here and they were expensive in D.C., and then all of a sudden, the Orioles caught fire. And then now the Nationals, we can get cheap tickets there. But let's hope for an Orioles win. And let's also hope this, that, you know, Brandon Scott is working his ass off. And he is trying to do the right things. And we talked about how, and this goes back to Derek's point about a black-controlled municipality. But this is Baltimore, and Baltimore has institutional racism. Baltimore also has a lot of white money in the foundation world, in the universities, including this one and a couple other universities I don't need to name that are in Baltimore. And whether the municipality is black or white controlled, Asian controlled, they have to work within the system and within this history of racial inequality. And I think Brandon Scott is doing a really good job. Crime has gone down in the last 10 years. the police force has been worked on. I don't know if it's been changed. It's hard to change not only Baltimore's police force, but any police force within the United States. People are moving here. There is hope. There is change. There is growth. And I think Brandon Scott is trying to make that growth more equitable. But it's a tough fight. So let's hope the Orioles win, and let's hope Brandon Scott keeps doing what he does. All right. Thank you.